You and I are looking at a guy locals called the junk mechanic, fixing pure trash. Busted old trucks with cracked engine blocks. Motors with stripped threads and seized pistons that fancy auto shops laughed right out the door. He resurrected them inside a beaten-down repair shop sitting on the edge of Harlow, Texas. Yet 6 years ago, Isaac sat inside the slick boardroom of the absolute largest aerospace company in America and warned them their new propulsion system was gonna kill someone. They fired him that afternoon. He packed a single box, drove 6 hours south, and never looked back. Until one quiet Tuesday morning in September. 3 black SUVs with plain government plates rolled right up to his dusty garage doors. A woman stepped out of the middle ride wearing a gray suit, clutching a thick classified folder. She stared Isaac dead in the eyes, like she had already memorized every line on his face. What they desperately needed did not exist in any advanced laboratory on Earth. We are about to discover it was hiding inside his dirty garage, the countdown already running. Harlow woke up pretty slow most days. The gas station on Route 12 unlocked at 6 a.m. The local diner on Calhoun Street started pouring coffee around 6:30. And by 7 our grease-stained genius was already flat on his back under a 1995 Ford F-150 owned by a retired schoolteacher named Raymond. A guy who could never afford the steep prices at Harlow Premier Auto across the street. His shop smelled heavily of motor oil, burning rubber, and a faint metallic scent baked deep into that concrete floor over 30 long years. His dad threw the place together using scrap steel beams and cheap second-hand lumber, and Isaac never bothered changing the floor plan. Tools hung on the pegboard in pure chaos to anyone passing by, making perfect sense to his brilliant mind. He had no mechanics, no young apprentices, no front desk. Just Isaac and a cheap transistor radio resting on a dusty shelf. Sitting above the parts bin, humming a San Antonio jazz station quietly enough to let his brilliant, beautiful mind actually work. His everyday clients were the folks those big dealerships rejected. Rusty old farm trucks and beaten delivery vans with bad transmissions slipping hard between second and third gear. Tractors with broken hydraulic lines baked dry by years of brutal Texas heat. The man never even gave a price up front. He just solved the problem first, handing the owner a bill when they finally showed up. And that repair bill was always shockingly cheap. Dale Hutchins, the guy running Harlow Premier Auto next door, made a daily habit of strolling right up to the chain-link fence dividing the 2 lots just to throw out some version of his usual insult. Today he smirked at 3 mechanics in matching blue shirts, who all laughed right on cue. Merritt working on Raymond's old death trap again. Dale barked it loud enough to echo across the gravel. Man spends more time under garbage than a raccoon. Our mechanic heard every single word. He just twisted a wrench one more quarter turn, staying dead silent. He had never dignified Dale with an answer, and he definitely wasn't starting today. He finished fixing that old exhaust manifold and wiped down the engine block, right when he heard heavy tires crunching the loose gravel outside. This was not just one lost driver, but a whole fleet rolling up together. Slowing with perfect precision, parking in a tight formation. Watch what happens next. He dropped his rag and rolled out from the frame. Picture this. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans sitting side by side at his junkyard gate, engines rumbling. Windows blacked out way past legal civilian limits, and on the back bumpers, not a single license plate in sight. Just pristine unmarked steel. A door swung open on the middle truck. A woman stepped right down into the gravel. Her low heels sank right into the soft dirt of his messy, unpaved driveway. Early 40s, dark hair chopped right at the jawline, carrying herself with real heavy authority. She had the posture of a person used to walking into places she wasn't wanted. She marched across the dirty yard straight up to him, offering a badge. The grease-covered mechanic stared, never reaching. The seal showed a blue globe cut by a space orbit. Right under the photo, the badge read Eleanor Voss, Director of Systems Engineering. NASA Office of Launch and Orbital Programs, Mr. Merritt, she said. I need about 10 minutes of your time. Isaac peered past her, eyeing the other 2 trucks still keeping their doors shut solid. You brought a whole escort for 10 minutes? I brought fellow aerospace engineers, she replied. They stay inside because I asked them to. No more explanation needed. The power dynamic spoke. Leaning his grease-stained shirt against a broken truck fender, he crossed his thick arms. I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement 6 years back, he muttered. Anything about Nexora Aerospace stays totally off the table. That paper only hides private company secrets, Eleanor countered. It means zero when we face a massive national security threat. She pulled out a fat manila folder, dropping it right on the dusty truck hood separating them. I am not here regarding Nexora. I came for a satellite named Obsidian 7. Let's listen closely. And I think you already know the flaw, because you called it 6 years before launch. The brilliant mechanic stood frozen, his sharp eyes piercing hers. Silence hung heavy in the garage until he finally glanced down at the worn file. Leave it sitting there, he grunted. I will check it when I am ready. He shuffled to the messy back wall of his shop, pouring thick black coffee from a tired machine that had been running since 5 in the morning. He just stood there, back turned to the NASA boss for 60 seconds. Turning back around, he saw her rooted to the exact same patch of dirt. No phone in hand, not even shifting her balance. With heavy grease on his hands, he flipped the file open. Top page showed a dense spacecraft telemetry readout. Thruster pressure data logging space flight intervals every 93 minutes flat. Raw math stacked in tight columns. The junkyard mechanic scanned the first column for 4 seconds, checked the second, then stared straight at Eleanor Voss. He dropped onto a rusty garage stool, missing one of its rubber feet. His oil-stained thumb flipped to page 3, then 4. Sitting wasn't part of his plan. The hidden genius inside him just took over as his weary legs gave out. You and I see it. The math forced him down, no random decay here. This was a crystal-clear pattern. The exact same breakdown he warned them about in a technical file some suit tossed into a deep classified vault without bothering to finish reading it. He stared up from the grimy file. How long? Eleanor didn't blink. 31 days from this morning. After that, the attitude control system loses grip on the orbital burn, and the satellite starts falling out of the sky. Isaac dropped the file on a greasy truck hood. Where is it now? 240 miles over the Indian Ocean, polar orbit. Controlled descent isn't an option. She took a breath. That report you wrote in 2017 warned about this. A valve tolerance failure caused by endless cycles of freezing cold. Every aerospace engineer at Nexora who read that file was told to ignore it. I dug up a copy in a classified archive 3 weeks back. Then you know what the problem is. I know exactly what's wrong, Eleanor replied. I just don't know how we're going to fix it. We have 31 days to bypass a valve assembly floating in lower Earth orbit. That is why I'm standing in your dirt driveway in Harlow, Texas. Isaac stayed quiet. He stared at the grease and dirt on his boots, then finally looked up. Let me finish what I'm working on, he muttered. Come back in 2 hours. Let's step back a bit. 6 years ago, spring of 2017. Isaac Merritt stood pitching at a pristine conference table on the 12th floor of Nexora Aerospace headquarters. Down in Houston, he patiently explained why the new Prometheus drive propulsion assembly was guaranteed to fail. He was 38 years old at the time. A top-tier aerospace engineer with 12 patents and a flawless professional reputation that he had spent 15 grueling years building. 11 people sat in that room. Cameron Ashford sat quietly at the far end of the table. Officially the head of engineering, Cameron was the vice president of technical programs. Flanked by 2 program managers and a corporate lawyer whose sudden presence Isaac didn't expect and certainly didn't find very encouraging. Giselle Hartman, the chief executive. She sat right beside Cameron with her hands neatly folded, wearing a blank expression Isaac knew incredibly well. It was that polite corporate patience people use when they've already made up their minds. Isaac brought 47 warning slides. He spent 6 weeks prepping it, running the heat models 4 separate times just to prove his math. The secondary pressure regulation valve inside the third-stage drive carried a strict design tolerance of plus or minus 0.004% across its rated limit. Under normal lab conditions, the assembly tested perfectly. But the real-world temperature swings of a polar orbit satellite, going from brutal solar heat to freezing deep space shadows during every 93-minute orbital lap, created a compounding thermal shock pattern that pushed way past the safe limits. Not by much, but in propulsion. You and I know that not by much is the difference between a working satellite and space junk. Isaac had mapped out the entire failure cascade. The part would start breaking down between month 18 and month 24. By month 28, the drive assembly would completely lose pressure. The billion-dollar satellite would go dark. He begged for 4 more months to rework that valve assembly to the perfect tolerance. But the Department of Defense contract demanded the first hardware delivery in 11 short months. Cameron Ashford just stared at Isaac's slide, projecting total failure. He glanced over at Giselle. Then he turned back to Isaac, wearing that look of forced patience that Isaac immediately recognized as a corporate mask hiding something much colder. Your model parameters sit completely outside the validated heritage range for this vehicle, Cameron said. The testing data we already gave the client simply does not support your failure theory. Isaac explained again. Their test data relied on a cycle frequency that completely ignored harsh orbital reality. Cameron coldly reminded him that the client had already accepted it. Isaac fired back that they only accepted it because the real flawed model was hidden. Dead silence fell. Giselle Hartman just stared at her clean hands. Isaac simply refused to sign that design approval. Exactly 2 weeks later, they fired him, blaming a vague violation of internal security protocols. A charge so perfectly vague you could not fight it, yet sharp enough to blacklist him. He was 38 years old, holding 12 patents and a stellar reputation now stained forever by a disciplinary dismissal. He took the payout and drove south to get his hands dirty. For years, he never checked to see if the disaster happened. He liked to tell himself he had simply moved on. But deep in those quiet, oil-stained nights, he knew the truth. He could not survive knowing he was right. Eleanor Voss had absolutely no intention of finding Isaac Merritt. She was hunting the source of a strange aerospace telemetry anomaly that none of her experts could crack. But you and I know the trail led to him. The Obsidian 7 satellite ran perfectly for 21 months before its pressure readings started showing. Bizarre deviations deep in the propulsion subsystem logs. Tiny changes, the kind of noise a lazy program manager would just brush off as sensor drift. But Eleanor had survived 17 gritty years in launch systems. She refused to blame sensor drift until she had ruthlessly eliminated every other possible explanation. She yanked 60 days of full telemetry logs, tossing them to her best analysts completely blind, no hints given. Just told them to find the pattern. 10 days later they found it. The pressure deviation was totally cyclic. It looped every 93 minutes like clockwork. That was absolutely not sensor drift. 93 minutes was the exact orbital period of Obsidian 7. A deviation matching that orbital cycle meant something very real was actually happening to the spacecraft every time it hit a specific environmental transition point. Eleanor dug up the original design specs for the Prometheus drive assembly, chewed through those heavy thermal cycling specs, and finally found, buried deep in a dusty classified archive under a forgotten file category no modern NASA analyst would ever open, a report written by Isaac R. Merritt dated March 14, 2017. Predicting the exact failure you and I are watching ruin that live telemetry. Eleanor had dialed Cameron that very morning. He held real power now. He was a lead NASA advisor holding a sweet contract Nexora brokered 18 months ago. Cameron didn't hesitate at all. That report came from a fired employee with serious performance issues, he told her. No one else on our aerospace engineering team ever validated his crazy methodology. Eleanor pointed out the math looked incredibly solid and technically sound. Cameron quickly fired back. He reminded her Isaac got sacked. Fired for cause. He claimed that rogue analysis never passed internal review. Eleanor thanked the suit for his time and hung up the phone. Then she hunted down Isaac Merritt's latest address in the licensing records. The database pointed straight to a dusty garage in Harlow, Texas. You and I should look at the timeline her team modeled that afternoon. They had 32 days before the attitude control system completely failed to hold orbital position. After that, the massive satellite would begin a descent that NASA's official contingency protocols had absolutely no solution for. She booked a flight down to San Antonio the very next morning. Isaac strolled back into his grease-stained garage right around midday. Eleanor sat on a beat-up wooden step stool near the wall, studying data on her secure tablet. The broken trucks outside hadn't moved an inch. She stood up immediately. Isaac glanced at the classified folder resting exactly where he left it on the rusty truck hood, then met her eyes. "That 93-minute cycle," he asked. "Your analyst flagged it?" "Somebody flagged it," Eleanor admitted, "but none of those experts could actually explain it." "It's mechanical resonant vibration," Isaac explained, "not just thermal alone. The thermal shifts from orbital shadow transit shake that valve housing at a specific frequency. That perfectly matches the assembly's own mechanical resonance band. Your engineers modeled the thermal stress fine and the vibration fine, but entirely separately. Nobody combined those two transfer functions in one model because your disconnected engineering groups simply never talk or cross-reference. That valve isn't failing from intense heat. It breaks because it shakes itself apart at a hidden frequency that only appears in combination." He spoke with the quiet relief of someone finally describing a truth they've carried alone for 6 long years, finally permitted to let it out. "I just lack the raw orbital data to prove that resonance piece in my initial report. I had the heat models and a rough projected vibration band, but the math wasn't tight enough to force them into a conclusion. Now you hold 21 months of live flight data, and if I'm right, that resonance peak is going to show up as a secondary harmonic inside the pressure oscillation at exactly 1/3 of that primary cycle period." Eleanor was already frantically pulling data on her screen. She scrolled for a tense moment. 31-minute secondary harmonic," she whispered, stunned. "It's right there. I honestly completely missed it as a harmonic subcomponent. I assumed it was just instrument noise." Isaac nodded grimly. "Not instrument noise. Now watch this." Cameron Ashford arrived in Harlow the next morning unannounced. He drove himself there in a basic rental car. Eleanor realized this sneaky move was highly unusual for Cameron whenever he traveled on official corporate business. "Watch this unfold." He stepped into the grease-stained garage at 9:40, sizing up the room like a guy running quick emotional math before he finally spoke. Isaac sat at the grimy workbench. He wasn't fixing Raymond's truck. He was sketching complex designs with a cheap mechanical pencil. Cameron lingered in the doorway and offered a stiff good morning. Isaac just nodded. Cameron claimed he was just in the neighborhood and figured a face-to-face chat might clear things up. A total lie, and both of these guys knew it. He insisted the Obsidian 7 aerospace crisis was being managed strictly through official NASA channels, and his corporate team at Nexora was already building a quick software patch. He just wanted the so-called junk mechanic to get the full picture before jumping to conclusions. Isaac quietly asked what exactly that full picture looked like. Cameron pointed out that Isaac's 2017 tech report had been reviewed by plenty of top-tier engineers back then, and the engine failure he warned about was completely dismissed by all the formal peer reviews. Isaac calmly replied that he knew that. Cameron warned him that any fresh ideas he threw into this current mess would face serious scrutiny and could never bypass their shiny formal engineering protocols. Isaac held his gaze for a second. "You should talk to Eleanor," he finally muttered. Cameron's polished mask slipped just a fraction, barely a twitch, but Isaac caught it through the grime. The suit walked out shortly after. Marching back to his flashy rental car, Cameron immediately pulled out his phone. The whole conversation took under 2 minutes. The only sounds you could make out over, on the other end of the line, after Giselle Hartman picked up, was Cameron's tight voice hissing, "We have a problem." Eleanor showed up an hour after Cameron bailed. She marched inside and dropped her laptop bag onto the oil-stained workbench. She announced the NASA board had officially greenlit his consultancy, though they still needed to run a background check. She also warned him that Cameron submitted a formal memo to the board the previous night, begging that Isaac's technical work get suspended pending a strict legal review of his old NDA. "How much time did that memo cost us?" Isaac asked. "About 12 hours, Eleanor replied. The board finally agreed the national security loophole was enough. She stared at the grease-smudged papers littering his bench. "What is that?" Isaac pushed forward 5 pages, absolutely covered edge to edge in raw, handwritten math. "The resonance," Molly told her, "the complete one. I've been crunching these numbers since 2 in the morning." She stared at the pages for a long beat. "You did by hand. Don't have the software licenses anymore." Eleanor just stared at his complex calculations. Without a word, she reached into her bag and grabbed a heavy satellite phone. She dialed a number and dropped just 4 words. "Bring the equipment in." Within 48 hours. Here's where it gets good. Half of Isaac's dusty garage became a high-tech command center. 3 massive monitors now sat on a dirty steel work table, hauled all the way from Houston by Eleanor's dedicated logistics crew. They rigged up an encrypted broadband connection, pumping through a portable satellite terminal, sitting on a tripod right in his scrapyard. Adrian Cole, the youngest aerospace engineer on Eleanor's team, just 26 years old. Adrian had an MIT master's and a JPL internship. Now he was assigned to work directly alongside Isaac. He showed up the second morning with a heavy backpack and the carefully maintained look of a guy told to keep an open mind, who was clearly struggling to do exactly that. Adrian studied the mechanic's initial aerospace report during his flight. Read it 3 times, actually. He found the engineering totally solid. But what the data actually meant, he wasn't sure. Knowing the author was currently wrenching in a roadside garage with 0 aerospace credentials and grease permanently stained into his dirty hands. Working with Isaac for an hour shattered Adrian's expectations. You and I might call it a quiet realignment. Nothing dramatic, no single massive revelation. Just passing moments where the mechanic casually dropped insights that were 3 steps beyond Adrian's own engineering analysis, spoken without a single ounce of arrogant brilliance. Just the blunt, plain honesty of an ordinary guy who had lived deep inside this technical puzzle for 6 years, quietly grinding every rough edge completely smooth. By the second late afternoon, Isaac tapped a hidden harmonic signature buried in the pressure telemetry. Houston's entire NASA engineering team missed it completely. He explained the meaning in 2 plain sentences, then scribbled the corrective math on the back of a greasy AutoZone receipt. Adrian snapped a photo with his phone, forwarding it to Houston without a single word. 12 minutes later, Houston desperately replied, asking who solved it. Adrian typed "the mechanic." He didn't explain further, and honestly nobody dared ask. Meanwhile, the memo Cameron filed with the oversight board blew up 2 days later into an official legal threat from Nexora's corporate lawyers sent straight to NASA's top legal team. The notice claimed Isaac's hands-on involvement with the OBSIDN-7 fix was a total violation of his 2017 non-disclosure agreement, targeting specific clauses about leaking early experimental design methods and secret engineering analysis he developed while stuck at Nexora. The legal trap was technically brilliant. Here's the thing. They never claimed the mechanic was wrong, nor denied his grim prediction. They just argued that his brilliant fix was using aerospace analysis he only knew from his past life at Nexora, and letting him help NASA amounted to stealing their pricey corporate intellectual property. It was exactly the kind of slippery logic that sounded insane to a practical mechanic, but perfectly logical to a suit avoiding the actual report. Naturally, part of the oversight board panicked and took it seriously. Eleanor got a tense call from her deputy director that Wednesday afternoon, warning her they might have to completely pause Isaac's crucial work while the lawyers fought it out. She played along, hung up the phone, and drove straight to his garage. She found the junk mechanic sitting on the hard floor. Not under a rusty truck, but sitting cross-legged. He had 3 NASA telemetry readouts scattered across the dirty concrete, balancing a cheap yellow notepad right on his greasy knee. He didn't even bother looking up when she walked inside. "The software fix that Nexora pitched is going to fail," he muttered. "They want to tweak the valve command sequence so it fires less often. Sure, that drops the vibration levels in the short term, but it also cripples their actual pressure regulation authority, meaning those navigation burns will chew through the fuel reserves way faster than the mission ever planned for. You gain maybe 10 days of time before the fuel dries up entirely and that satellite drifts right out of orbit." He wiped his hands. Their corporate engineers know this. Yet some suit approved it anyway. Eleanor sat on a greasy stool. "The board might force me to pull you off this, while the lawyers review everything." "How long for that review?" "Probably 3 weeks at a minimum." Silence hung in the garage. "We have 31 days, Eleanor muttered, "which means 28. Isaac stared at the scattered telemetry sheets covering his floor. He stayed perfectly quiet for a minute, then stood up and walked over to his old personal laptop. The heavy rig he used back in Houston, the exact one he packed when they pushed him out. He dug through a file directory, scrolling to a folder marked February 2017, and opened an old email draft that never actually got sent. Attached to it was the true, final version of his original failure report. Not the garbage they handed the committee. Let's look closely at his raw, unfiltered truth. The exact one he wrote before Cameron's polished team ordered him to alter the methodology. The file's hidden metadata clearly tracked the creation date and the full version history, alongside the direct access log pulled from Nexora's internal system. And right there at the top of that access list sat Cameron Ashford. That log proved the suit opened his file 4 separate times right before firing Isaac. Isaac forwarded that file to Eleanor without a single word. Then he typed one brilliant line: "The NDA I signed cannot erase metadata." That emergency tech review kicked off at 9 a.m. Thursday, linking up Houston, Washington, and 2 massive contractor facilities, and one grease-stained garage in Harlow, Texas, all over a secure video link. Cameron Ashford opened the call from Washington, flanked by 2 polished Nexora engineers and some corporate lawyer hovering just off camera. He proudly presented the new Nexora software, a fix loaded with slick graphics and a timeline promising a resolution in 25 days, dismissing Isaac's hidden genius as the rogue work of an uncertified mechanic operating totally outside formal reviews. And he sneered the word unvalidated 4 different times in just 6 minutes. Eleanor just listened without interrupting once. When Cameron finally stopped talking, she said, "Isaac has something to share." Cameron scoffed. "I want on the record that any analysis from a non-credentialed source," Eleanor cut in. "It's already on the record, Cameron. Our junk mechanic had 0 polished slides. You and I know real brilliance doesn't need polish. He just had 3 pages of scanned, handwritten math. That first grimy page broke down the resonant vibration model, perfectly combining the thermal and mechanical energy transfers, fusing those complex functions into one single system-level prediction. The second page was a raw, undeniable math comparison between Nexora's slick proposal and his own, proving clearly that the corporate Nexora approach would, buying them 9 to 11 days of life before the propellant ran dry. The third page held his handwritten corrective command sequence. 17 parameters, scratched out by hand, forcing that pristine valve into a safe sub-resonant mode, decoupling the harsh mechanical vibrations from the thermal cycle, halting the metal fatigue entirely without even touching the delicate pressure controls or the strict fuel budget. Cameron scoffed. "This hasn't been validated by any peer review process." But a voice from the Houston team cut in. "I ran his model. The mechanic's numbers check out completely." It was Grace, a brilliant dynamics engineer on Eleanor's team for 4 years, breaking her silence to defend a grease monkey. Another contractor chimed in. "That 93-minute harmonic suppression in his third parameter set, I'm getting the exact same result. His raw solution fixes the resonance." A third voice muttered something in the background, too quiet for the crisp audio feed to pick up. But the word the mechanic heard was unmistakable. 4 seconds after that voice spoke, Cameron's polished camera feed went pitch black. The call didn't drop. The executive had just manually killed his video. His microphone stayed hot for another 12 agonizing seconds. For 12 seconds, everyone heard a heavy chair scrape and a heavy boardroom door slam shut. Then his audio cut out too. The corporate lawyer for Nexor stayed on the line, sitting in absolute silence for the rest of the meeting. They just hung up when Eleanor formally closed the technical review, and she started pushing the junk mechanics repair framework through for expedited aerospace certification. Eleanor stayed on the line after all the suits had finally logged off. She stared at the quiet genius through her tiny camera. "You know this doesn't end here," she warned softly. Isaac just stared at his greasy screen. "I know. I knew that 6 years ago too. Stick with me here." The satellites started failing faster than their worst-case models predicted. By the morning of the 7th day after Eleanor first pulled into his dusty town, the satellite executed 2 automated altitude correction burns within a tight 4-hour window, a firing frequency those pristine mission profiles never saw coming. Each panic burn consumed 3 times the expected propellant volume. Their fuel reserve, which was supposed to last 24 more days at normal rates, shrank to a brutal operational window of barely 11 days. That ticking clock meant the fancy software fix Cameron's corporate team had pitched, which needed 25 days just to implement and test, was now completely useless. The only surviving option in that time frame was the dirty-handed mechanic's brilliant command sequence, and his fix would have to be uplinked within 72 hours, giving the system time to stabilize before its next massive orbital move. The panicked oversight board convened at 2 in the morning. That metadata file Isaac gave Eleanor had landed on the General Counsel's desk 18 hours earlier. Those logs proved Cameron secretly viewed the mechanic's unredacted report 4 times, occurring exactly 1 week before his unfair termination. Legally speaking, it wasn't exactly a slam-dunk case, but it was enough dirty laundry to severely complicate their non-disclosure claims. Enough that their corporate lawyers backed off. You just can't bury real genius forever. Cameron's shiny corporate consulting gig got halted pending review. The board finally cleared Isaac, under Eleanor's strict supervision. Nobody uttered the word vindication. Nobody offered a single apology. They hid behind aerospace terms like operational timeline and mission continuity, basically the same exact thing. Isaac finally stepped foot in Houston. This dusty mechanic hadn't seen the city in 6 years. Eleanor actually drove him from the airport herself. Adrian noticed that senior program directors rarely played chauffeur for random external aerospace consultants. The NASA facility at the Johnson Space Center felt entirely different. Different from the Nexora building, a contrast you only caught after years in both worlds. The daily pace shifted, the entire engineering vocabulary changed. The sheer weight of the mission stakes hung heavy, a density Isaac felt in the room. They handed our grease-stained genius a temporary badge and desk. He never even touched that desk. Picture this with me. A scrap mechanic standing at the primary orbital command terminal, just staring, scanning the screen flashing Obsidian 7's real-time telemetry feed. 37 elite engineers packed the room. Eleanor guarded his right. Adrian flanked his left, gripping a printed command sequence like a physical redundant safety net. No Hollywood drama filled that control room. Nothing felt performed. Just the heavy silence of professionals who knew exactly what these next minutes meant. They had zero room for anything except the fix. Isaac studied the mission sequence. He crafted those 17 parameters over 7 grueling days, tweaking the code every single morning when fresh satellite telemetry dropped. But his core math was dead on since night 1, sketched inside his dirty garage. He knew every single number. He carried them all in his head, just like a master carpenter memorizes the exact dimensions of a frame. Not to show off to NASA brass, but because those calculations were just there, woven deep into the very structure of his mind. He entered the data with the calm, deliberate precision of a man who rehearsed absolutely nothing because he inherently understood everything. 8 long seconds passed. The signal bounced from Houston to a New Mexico relay antenna, blasting upward to a comms satellite in geosynchronous orbit, piercing 240 miles of space, hitting a vehicle the size of a bus moving at 17,000 miles per hour high above the Indian Ocean. Now watch this. The primary display's pressure gauge, stubbornly pinned in the red zone for 4 straight days, finally shifted one single color band to the left, orange. It held steady the secondary harmonic display, which Adrian added to the monitoring setup 2 days prior on this mechanic's brilliant advice, completely flatlined. The brutal oscillation destroying that valve assembly, 193 minutes at a time, just went quiet. Another orbital cycle passed by. That critical pressure reading shifted down from orange to yellow. One more cycle after that, and it locked into green. The third cycle closed. The green held completely steady and clean with absolutely zero fluctuation. Adrian clapped exactly once, a single sharp crack breaking the silence. And then the entire room followed. Not with the screaming eruption of a launch celebration, but in a far quieter, what you and I call the profound relief of experts holding breath for 10 brutal days, finally realizing this grease-stained mechanic had just saved them all. Isaac didn't bother turning around. He just stared at that green pressure gauge for a long minute. Then he stepped away from the console, walking out to the hallway where the humming fluorescent lights burned just a little colder, and the Chaos from the operations floor was muffled behind a heavy fire door. He pressed his back against the cold wall and shut his eyes. He wasn't cheering, he wasn't even feeling that rush of relief. He was doing the hardest thing a misunderstood mechanic can do, accepting he was right after 6 long years of suits calling his work garbage. 30 seconds later, Eleanor pushed through that heavy door. She didn't say a word. She just stood beside him. You and I know that kind of silence, when two folks who get each other just share the space waiting. Slowly, Isaac opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, white acoustic tiles, standard government spec. Then he checked the opposite wall, before finally meeting Eleanor's steady gaze. One single nod, she nodded back, then they went back inside. The official investigation that kicked off wasn't handled in some courtroom. It ran through the strict technical audit NASA triggers right after any major propulsion failure on a highly classified mission. That audit meant tearing apart every single engineering choice made during the blueprints and sign-offs for the Prometheus experimental drive project. Every greasy schematic, every corporate signature, and every Nexora review got pulled. The final audit never saw the light of public day. It spat out a highly classified mechanical report passed around a few quiet desks. And the fallout from those pages? The kind that breaks careers quietly and forever. Cameron Ashford quietly walked away from his cushy NASA consulting gig 3 weeks later, claiming he wanted to explore different business opportunities. Nexora Aerospace got scrubbed right off the board for the next big propulsion contract. Not with some flashy public firing. Not dragged into a courtroom. Just the cold, brutal reality of government bidding. Their shiny proposal was weighed and trashed. Look at it this way, in the aerospace game, everyone who mattered understood that quiet death blow. 10 days after the dust settled, Giselle Hartman shot Isaac an email. Just 2 short paragraphs. Nowhere in there did she ever type the words "I'm sorry." Instead, she claimed those old choices back in 2017 failed to accurately reflect the true brilliance of his technical work. She hoped he'd get that corporate pressures had forced their hand, a fancy way of admitting they bet on the wrong horse. Isaac read the message exactly once. Sitting at his greasy workbench on a quiet Tuesday morning, he just ignored it completely. The official restoration of his professional aerospace engineering license got pushed through NASA's Technical Standards Office on a heavily fast-tracked review. Eleanor proudly signed that sponsorship letter. The actual license showed up in a basic white envelope, carrying absolutely no fancy notes beyond the standard printed forms. Isaac just tossed it on the workbench beneath a stained coffee mug for 3 straight days, before finally shoving it into his old man's rusty filing cabinet right next to the junk truck titles. Eleanor rang his shop the night. Let's watch this unfold. Eleanor knew his certification cleared, she had been tracking it. There is a real position open, she told him. Not at Nexora, never there. It is a direct staff role with the Propulsion Systems Analysis Group down in Houston. You would lead the analysis on next-generation drive architecture for the Lunar Surface Access Program. She paused. It is a real offer, Isaac, not some polite courtesy. The mechanic stayed dead quiet. Let me go back to Harlow first, he finally murmured. There are things I need to finish, Eleanor stated. Finish them and then what? The quiet dad hesitated. After a beat, she asked, are you closing that roadside garage or handing it off? Another heavy pause. Then, Isaac gave an answer Eleanor would remember later as the first time the quiet mechanic said something that wasn't a rigid technical assessment or emotional deflection. He muttered, I will let you know, it certainly was not a yes. But it was not the stubborn no he would have given. 6 months ago, Eleanor Voss had spent her career listening for that exact difference. Between those two things, her entire aerospace career. He drove his beat-up truck back to Harlow that Thursday, windows rolled down. A faint San Antonio jazz station barely fighting through the rushing road noise. That forgotten roadside garage looked exactly as he had left it. The sign with peeling paint, the greasy scrap bin sitting in perfect hidden order. The familiar scent of oil, scrap metal, and baked concrete, a smell the quiet dad linked not just to gritty labor but home. Picture it with me. That harsh Texas light spilling through one dusty south-facing window late in the day. Raymond's broken truck still sat in the corner. He had left the junker unfinished when Eleanor's glossy SUVs arrived. The genius grabbed his greasy tools, slid beneath the rusted frame, and lay in total silence for a minute, listening to his dusty sanctuary settle in the stifling afternoon heat. Then his dirty hands grabbed a wrench, finding comfort in the grime. Dale Hutchins drifted over to the rusty fence line around 4 o'clock, like always. But the local just stood there forever, speechless, staring at those 3 sleek black Suburbans parked outside the junk shop. The corporate logistics team had not yet returned to haul the brilliant experimental equipment away. Dale lingered at the fence, eyeing the expensive vehicles, then studying the pathetic-looking garage. He didn't drop his usual junk mechanic insult. He just wandered back to his lot, utterly speechless. Isaac heard every footstep from beneath the oily truck. He kept completely silent. He had not spoken to Dale Hutchins in 6 years. Down here, silence was always the smartest play. His cell phone buzzed against the grease-stained concrete. He picked it up, wiping his hands. The screen read, "Eleanor." He answered. She confirmed the NASA transport team would arrive tomorrow for the hardware. Then she dropped the date for his first Houston Aerospace planning meeting. And then came a heavy silence. He recognized it immediately as the pause. Right before she blurted out what she had been debating, saying, "You know what is truly strange?" she asked. "I checked your garage on satellite imagery while deciding if I should even fly down. I stared at the map 3 times before driving out because I just could not reconcile the brilliant mind behind that report with the grease pit in the image." She paused. "I kept thinking I had the wrong address. We know better. Picture the scene with me." Isaac dropped his greasy wrench on the concrete, studying the belly of Raymond's pickup. At the rusted frame rails and those rough metal patches. At the ordinary repair work he was destined to finish before the day ended. "My father worked in this garage," he said. "He told me once that an engine doesn't need anyone to believe in it to run." He grabbed that grease-stained wrench once more. On the other end of the phone, he heard the NASA engineer, Eleanor, hesitate. She started to speak, paused, and quietly admitted he was absolutely right about that. He promised he'd meet her down in Houston. She softly agreed to see him there. The call ended. The dirty garage fell silent. An old radio in the corner softly played a slow, timeless jazz tune from decades ago. Outside, the fading Texas afternoon sun cast a brilliant golden glow across the mesquite trees bordering the dusty salvage yard. And Isaac Merritt, genius engineer mechanic. Think about it. The genius locals called junk who NASA desperately needed, then tried burying again. Put both grease-stained hands on his brilliant work and kept going.